Well, once again, good evening and welcome to our second evening, our second lecture of this series, reflecting on the Vatican II Pastoral Constitution, the Church in the Modern World. And before I welcome John, you see John here with us, just once again tonight to express our thanks to the University of Otago for allowing us to be here and to make use of their facilities at no cost. And again, thank you, Murray, thank you, David, for your welcome as the Department of Theology. Really good for us. This is a new thing for us and it's wonderful to be here. One of the good things about organising lectures is you can think of all the topics you find are interesting yourself and then find someone else to deliver them. And so last night we were very, privileged to have Anne Gilroy present on church and culture. And thinking on the topic of church and ethics, really at the top of the list when thinking of people to ask in New Zealand, it would be you, John Kleinsman, who comes to us from Wellington. When I started my master's a few years ago, the first piece of advice I was given was to go to the University of Otago Library and take out the master's thesis written by John Kleinsman, to read that and to make sure that my master's was of the same quality. Since then, John has completed a PhD through the Sydney College of Divinity. He hasn't given that to me to read. I have asked. And now is the director of the Nathaniel Centre, which is the New Zealand Catholic Bishops' Conference Centre for Bioethics, and is also a researcher for the Catholic Institute of Theology. And only last week, this is made public, very exciting news for John, and actually for all of us and a church. Next week, John is going to Rome to join in the Synod on the Family as a special participant. And I think that applause says it all, John. I think we're all really thrilled that you've been asked, and it says a lot about the promise that Synod holds. So over to you, John. Welcome to our gathering tonight, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Jared. Can you hear me okay? Is the microphone working all right? All right. Thank you for the welcome. It's great to come back to a place where I've spent more than 8 years of my life. And as Jared indicated, I did my Masters of Theology here and also my Bachelor of Theology here while I was resident at Holy Cross College. And it's great to see a number of faces here in the audience who I recognise and know and have known for a number of years. So again, thank you for the opportunity to do this, and congratulations to you as a diocese for taking this project on and for making it available throughout New Zealand. It's a wonderful document. It's a document that is broad in its scope, and I'm going to sort of zero in on one little bit of it. So it'll be a bit of a snapshot, and it probably reflects where I'm at the moment and some of the thinking and some of my own reflections in the last few months. So anyway, here goes. Some introductory comments. Pope Paul VI, in his address to the last general meeting of the Second Vatican Council, and that happened on the 7th of December 1965, so almost 50 years ago, speaks of a church that must be concerned not just with herself and with her relationship of union with God, but with humankind as it really is today. End of quote. He also speaks of the church's, quote, rich teaching as channeled in one direction, the service of humankind, of every condition, in every weakness and need, to be the servant of humanity. His comments echo the key themes and structure of the document that we are focusing on tonight and that you will be focusing on for the 3 days of this week. As someone who works in the field of bioethics, Gaudium et Spes is rich in themes that 50 years on are as relevant as ever. Themes such as the effects of technology, the move from a rather static concept of reality to a more dynamic evolutionary one, new and more efficient media of social communication, various forms of social and psychological slavery, the fostering of peace and avoidance of war, the dignity of the human person, and the nobility of marriage and family. And that's all language taken from the document itself. As one commentator puts it, Gaudium et Spes is the Magna Carta of human dignity. I want to begin with two quotes from the document to set up the backdrop to tonight's presentation and also to set the direction for my presentation. No one told me how to shift the slides on. Oh, the black keyboard? Yes. Thank you, Anne. The first quote, "The people of God believes that it is led by the Lord's Spirit who fills the earth." Comes from paragraph 11. I take from this quote that the world is a sacred place imbued with the glory of God. It is not simply a place where we are led to by the Holy Spirit, but the place where we are to encounter the divine Spirit. In the words of the well-known hymn, "Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit blows where it wills." We Christians, we Catholics, do not own or control or have a monopoly on the Holy Spirit. Importantly, it is a document that is addressed to and for all men and women. The second quote, and I think it's a very challenging quote, can be found at paragraph 19. Believers can have more than a little to do with the birth of atheism, to the extent that they neglect their own training in the faith or teach erroneous doctrine, or are deficient in their religious, moral, or social life. They must be said to conceal rather than reveal the authentic face of God and religion. The need to reveal the authentic face of God and religion through our religious, moral or social life is the thread which will run through and hold together the various thoughts that I want to share with you tonight. My thoughts are made with an eye on the upcoming Roman Synod on the family and address themes in Gaudium et Spes concerning the dignity of the human person and the nobility of marriage and family. My choice to offer what is really a selective commentary on these particular aspects of the document must not be taken as a failure to recognise the importance of many other themes, a number of which I imagine have been picked up already by Anne yesterday or will be picked up by the other speaker tomorrow. Now, it's always a good idea to begin a presentation with some definitions of the key concepts that are being explored. So, what do I understand by the term church? I understand it not fundamentally as an institution or as the magisterium, but first and foremost as the ecclesia, the gathering together in and through baptism of the people of God who are charged with a missionary role of giving witness to the unconditional love of God, the love that God has for each one of us. And we're called to do that in what we say and what we do and by who we are. We are each of us called to incarnate that love in our homes, in our workplaces, and in society through the establishment of just, loving, caring, merciful, and inclusive structures and institutions. A working definition for ethics. There are any number of definitions of ethics that I could provide. O'Neill and Black, in a book that's titled The Essential Moral Handbook, point out that the Greek word for ethos, which is at the root of the English word ethics, has a variety of different meanings. One meaning is related to the idea of morals, which relates to specific ways of doing things or customs. This understanding is, I think, well accepted and reflects contemporary usage. It explains why, very often, in common parlance, the terms ethics and morals are used interchangeably. A second well-known meaning is related to the idea of character, which has given rise to a specific branch of ethical theory known as virtue ethics. I accept both of these understandings. Interestingly, however, O'Neill and Black also point out that there is another less well-known meaning of the Greek word ethos, which links it with the concept of a residence or a home. What might this understanding have to do with moral character and moral action? O'Neill and Black note, and I quote, "Many people see home as the place where we belong, where we are ourselves." In that vein, they pose the question, might we not think of the moral life as a journey on which we are finding our way home to where we belong? They then suggest ethics and morality are about finding the way home to our true selves as believers in the God revealed to us in Jesus Christ. And being home is marked by right relationships with God, with others, with ourselves, and with creation. As an aside, the term ethics does not actually appear in Gaudium et Spes, while the term moral appears in various forms, a total of 30 times. Mind the gap. What do I mean by this term? Gaudium et Spes in paragraph 43 speaks of Christians as being the citizens of two cities. And when we search the Christian scriptures, we likewise find there various references to the notion of home, both our earthly home and our heavenly home. St. Paul, using imagery that calls to mind the travellings of our earliest nomadic ancestors, Abraham and others, refers in the second letter to the Corinthians, chapter 5, verses 1 to 6, to our earthly house as being a tent. Thus he writes, "For we know that if our earthly house, this tent, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens." Paul then reminds the Christians of Corinth of the inherent tension that lies at the heart of the Christian narrative and the Christian life. "Therefore," he writes, "we are always confident, knowing that while we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord." This passage and many others in the Scripture speak to the idea that we are all on a journey. As the people of God who are on the way, we are, by definition, living in a transitional space, a type of gap. This idea won't be new to any of you, but I'm choosing to focus on it because I think it provides an important lens through which we can assess the ethical implications of Christian discipleship. Throughout the history of Christendom, we have struggled, and we still struggle, to live with that tension. Various dualistic, ecclesiological and spiritual perspectives have emphasised and still emphasise the destination and eternal rewards at the expense of concern for the worldly reality in which we find ourselves. Equally, there are other ecclesiological and spiritual articulations of the Christian call to discipleship that emphasise concern for social action and political change within sufficient regard for what Gaudium et Spes refers to as our religious identity. As Pope Francis has reminded us on numerous occasions, the Church's identity is different from that of a social helping agency. The very different ethical implications for discipleship between these two very different ecclesiological and spiritual articulations need no explaining. Our understanding of what constitutes ethical behaviour and our understanding of the role and purpose of the Church as expressed in our spiritual understandings and practices are closely linked. And in the words of Gaudium et Spes, any split between the faith many profess and their daily lives deserves to be counted amongst the more serious errors of our age. The Scriptures, I suggest, ultimately call us to a form of restless, active presence in the world. Paul's emphasis on knowing that we are at home in the body, even while we experience a certain absence from God, points to the importance of living in the gap between the present and the eschaton. We are called literally to mind the gap and to continuously hold these two aspects in creative tension in a way that values our embodied existence. In the paragraph that comments on the diverse gifts of the Spirit, Gaudium et Spes recognises that the tension may be reflected in different church ministries. And I quote, "While the Holy Spirit calls some to give clear witness to the desire for a heavenly home and to keep that desire green amongst the human family, the Spirit summons others to dedicate themselves to the earthly service of humankind and to make ready the material of the celestial realm by this ministry of theirs. Yet the Spirit frees all of them, so that by putting aside love of self and bringing all earthly resources into the service of human life, they can devote themselves to that future when humanity itself will become an offering accepted by God." End of quote. The very fact that the Vatican II Council participants would name a document the Church in the modern world signals a significant ecclesiological and spiritual shift in mindset that had occurred in the period of time leading up to the Second Vatican Council. This shift is what made this document such an important one 50 years ago. It is, I suggest, what continues to make the document so important in our time for getting our ethics right, or, in the words of the document, for conceiving of the presence of the Church in the world today. So in light of what I've just been talking about, I want to suggest that we can now think about Christian ethics as that discipline operating in a particular space. That space which embraces and includes the world as well as the celestial realm, but not a space that we carve out apart from the world in which we live. Gaudium et Spes provides us with a frank analysis of that ethical space. In paragraph 7, it recognises that various new conditions and technological developments coming so rapidly and often in a disorderly fashion have begotten and intensified contradictions and imbalances so that many people in contemporary society are shaken. End of quote. And in paragraph 8 we read, "As for the family, discord results from population, economic and social pressures, or from difficulties which arise between succeeding generations, or from new social relationships between men and women. Differences crop up too between races and between various kinds of social orders, between wealthy nations and those which are less influential or are needy. Finally, between international institutions born of the popular desire for peace and the ambition to propagate one's own ideology, as well as collective greeds existing in nations or other groups. What results is mutual distrust, enmities, conflicts, and hardships. Of such, humans are at once the cause and the victim." End of quote. So nothing much has changed. In the paragraph that immediately follows, we then read, "The modern world shows itself at once powerful and weak, capable of the noblest deeds or the foulest. Before it lies the path to freedom or to slavery, to progress or retreat, to fraternity or hatred." So the gap between the ideal and the lived reality that we all experience in our own lives provides another ethical perspective on the idea of minding the gap. The gap we all know exists in ourselves, in our families, in our institutions, including the church, and in society. And yet it's the space where Christian discipleship must be exercised, and it is this space that must ultimately be informed by our ethics and morals. This in turn leads me to suggest that the integrity of our ethical or moral systems must ultimately be judged according to the way in which they help us to inhabit and navigate the gap between our own and other people's lived reality and the ideals that are articulated in the various laws, beliefs and teachings that together make up our Catholic Christian moral tradition. This approach to Christian morality and ethics simultaneously provides us with a way of understanding the specific role and place of our moral laws, beliefs and teachings. They are not an end in themselves. Yet they are critically important for pointing us in the right direction. In fact, they exist, I think, for the purpose of pointing out and marking the way ahead, much like the steel waratahs and horses that are used to mark the alpine tracks across the stony ridges that characterise many of our country's beautiful walkways. As someone who is a keen tramper, I have often appreciated the attention and efforts of those who have gone before me to form a track and to place markers and grab lines for those of us who would follow. Many is the time when we have found ourselves struggling to see the path, whether through inattention or because of a loss of visibility, as often occurs at altitude when the clouds and the mist can roll in so very suddenly. Similarly, I think, the purpose of our laws, beliefs and teachings is that they act as important markers and grab lines. Placed there by the Christian community, they are there to direct us back towards the main track when that is required and or provide something to hold on to when the way ahead is rough and rocky and we are struggling to move forward. On the other hand, we all know only too well that waratahs and ropes used together can and often are used as a means to demarcate certain areas, as a means to keep people out or away from specific areas. So too within the Christian community, our laws, beliefs and teachings can, and I think too often are used as a way of creating different zones or different classes of Catholics, as a way of separating the worthy from the unworthy, the sinners from the righteous, ultimately even as a way of excluding some from our faith community. For me, this is not a question of challenging the importance and place of rules, laws and teachings, but a matter of how we choose to view them and how we use them. Right now within the Roman Catholic Church, the debate about divorce, remarriage and admittance to the sacraments, for example, provides a ready example of the gap that exists between the lived reality of many people and the ideal vision for human flourishing that our church puts before us about the sacrament of marriage. Even a cursory analysis of this debate shows that amongst Catholics, theologians, pastors and laity, there are quite different approaches to minding that gap. What do I think I can usefully contribute to this debate tonight? Reflection on Gaudium et Spes, I will suggest, offers us a way of dealing with or minding the gap that is thoroughly Christ-like and therefore thoroughly ethical. And with that in mind, I'll proceed in the next section to develop the idea of ethics as dialogue, an insight that I believe is central to Gaudium et Spes. Gaudium et Spes is well known for its insistence on the need to scrutinise and interpret the signs of the times. That famous line occurs in paragraph 4. But it's perhaps less well known for its insistent and repeated call to respond to the signs of the times by entering into sincere dialogue. To quote from the document, "This council can provide no more eloquent proof of its solidarity with, as well as its respect and love for the entire human family, than by engaging with it in conversation." More eloquent than teaching, more eloquent than preaching. Which, of course, is not to say that there is no place for teaching or preaching in what the Church does and says. Just to say that the most eloquent Christian expression of our solidarity occurs when we sit down with persons with the express purpose of entering into a dialogue with them. In all, the call to dialogue occurs throughout Gaudium et Spes no less than 12 times, along with various adjectives such as honest dialogue, brotherly sisterly dialogue, fruitful dialogue, and prudent dialogue, as well as sincere dialogue. There are clear implications for ethics and theology, and in particular for moral theology. Ethicists, theologians, teachers, pastors, indeed all of us who call ourselves disciples because we've been baptised into the priesthood of all believers, must be attentive to the societal context in which we live, and secondly, must actively engage with people's issues and questions in and through meaningful and ongoing conversation. This, I suggest, has clear methodological implications for the practice of ethics, for the church magisterium, and for all those who teach and minister. It means, first of all, approaching, meeting, listening, reflecting, and learning before speaking and teaching. Something that traditionally I think we have not been particularly good at. I'm put in mind of the theologian Maura Ryan, a professor in Christian ethics, who once wrote that the truth is found in conversation. Whether or not Ryan wrote what she did with Gaudium et Spes in mind, her words certainly echo with paragraph 92, where the Council Fathers speak of the desire for such dialogue leading to truth through love alone, while warning that an appropriate measure of prudence must undoubtedly be exercised. That's in paragraph 92. Their reasoning for pursuing this approach is made abundantly clear. The desire for such dialogue, they write, excludes no one. A dialogical approach to ethics is, in other words, always an inclusive approach. Put positively, we have to say that ethical behaviour must, by definition, be inclusive behaviour. So the ethical message contained in Gaudium et Spes is, I think, unambiguous. Ethical behaviour involves an unwavering commitment to sincere and prudent dialogue. What are the implications of this? For me, it means that the truth can never be realised by way of a simple and abstract appeal to truths or laws in a book, which is not, to labour the point, to say that such formulations have no place or are irrelevant for us in our struggle to be faith-filled gospel people who are faithful to God. But 50 years on from the promulgation of Gaudium et Spes, we are still struggling, as much as ever, I would argue, to accept that inclusive dialogue is the key to arriving at the truth that we all seek. Too many sincere Christians, Catholics included, perhaps out of fear, prefer monologue over sincere and prudent dialogue. Too many of us still prefer to respond to the griefs and anxieties of the people of our age, to use the terminology from Gaudium et Spes, by quoting and re-quoting the truth as we encounter it in the printed word, preferring to fall back on documents such as the Catholic Catechism, which we quote often with a sense of self-righteousness from a safe distance, without any attempt to truly and sincerely engage in meaningful and inclusive dialogue. Analogous to the way in which state authorities are sometimes depicted in news reports, using megaphones to address unruly crowds in an attempt to restore order, we sometimes seem content to keep our distance from persons while letting our Catholic teachings or canon law do the talking for us. A far cry from the sincere dialogue that Gaudium et Spes spells out and calls us to. Contrast the Council Fathers' call to sincere dialogue in Gaudium et Spes with the actions of the Pharisees and teachers of the religious law in the story of the woman caught in adultery. Allow me to read that story. As Jesus was speaking, the teachers of religious law and Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. They put her in front of the crowd. "Teacher," they said to Jesus, "this woman was caught in the act of adultery. The law of Moses says to stone her. What do you say?" They were trying to trap him into saying something that they could use against him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote in the dust with his finger. They kept demanding an answer. So he stood up again and said, "All right, but let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone." Then he stooped down again and wrote in the dust. When the accusers heard this, they slipped away one by one, beginning with the oldest, until only Jesus was left in the middle of the crowd with the woman. Then Jesus stood up again and said to the woman, "Where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you?" "No, Lord," she said. And Jesus said, "Neither do I. Go and sin no more." It's a rich and challenging story. And with apologies to those of you in this room who are more qualified than me to comment on the meaning of the scriptures, what follows is more in the nature of a spiritual or theological reflection on that story rather than an academic scriptural exegesis. Firstly, I'm intrigued by the reference to Jesus writing in the dust. What might this represent? Perhaps there are deliberate overtones here of Genesis 3:19, which documents the human struggle of life after the fall until we ultimately return to the ground from where we originated. For dust we are, and to dust we will return. In which case, and taking a metaphorical approach, it strikes me that the dust referred to might be interpreted as representing the earthiness and messiness and struggle and finitude of our lives. What can we take from this? It highlights for me that the place where ethical issues surface and are resolved is in the midst of our fragility and failure and mortality, in the midst of the messiness and struggle of our lives. This is where ethical discipleship calls us to be. And it is neither a nice place to be nor an easy place to be. Secondly, take note of where the encounter, the conversation between Jesus and the woman and the Pharisees and religious teachers is happening. It's in a public square, the public square. It's not in a synagogue or the church or behind university or seminary walls. Note too what happens with the accusers after Jesus confronts them. They leave one by one, starting with the oldest. Why the oldest? I asked myself. I've thought quite a bit about that. It's not a line that I'd ever really noticed before. Perhaps it's the wise elders as the carriers of the wisdom of the community who realise first the implications of what Jesus has said and the implications of his demeanour to the woman. Perhaps. But also perhaps, being the most steeped in the law and therefore the most entrenched in a worldview characterised by legalism, the oldest are the first to leave because they cannot ultimately tolerate being in the public square, because religion is for them something that belongs in the confines of their respective institutions. Perhaps they all eventually leave because a legalistic religious approach neither belongs and nor can it survive in the dust and dirt where those who are wounded and suffering find themselves, and, importantly, where Jesus is to be found. Thirdly, like others, I'm also intrigued by what Jesus might have written in the dust. A work colleague and friend of mine and I were discussing this the other day, and she shared with me the insight of one of her Year 12 students whose thoughtful response to this was to suggest that Jesus was writing a simple question. And that question, she suggested, was, where is the man? It makes you think, especially when the account makes it clear that the man must have been present, because we read that the woman was caught in the act of adultery. In my mind, however, I like to imagine that Jesus is writing a personal message to the woman. I imagine it's a message from one of the Psalms. Perhaps the following verses from Psalm 139, which is a favourite of mine, or a similar message of mercy and hope. Psalm 39, there we read, "Where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me." Reflecting further on the story and asking how it speaks to us in this post-Vatican II period we live in, it also strikes me that there are numerous instances where, instead of using our Catholic Christian teaching to inform and write a personal, caring and hopeful message in the dust, we feel instead the need to remind such persons once again of the way in which they have transgressed, and to remind them that such behaviour has consequences, serious consequences. Too many Christians, including Catholics, seem driven by a need to insist on following through on consequences that are ultimately punitive, consequences that do violence to the person, if not in a physical way, then certainly emotionally and socially, by placing them, metaphorically speaking, in front of the crowd. What does it mean to put someone in front of the crowd? The very act involves separating and excluding. It reminds people that they are different and effectively enforces their absence from the gathered community. It marks them out in such a way that they become open to judgment. How does Jesus deal with this? Astutely, he reminds the actors in the story, and we who are listeners, that any such separation is arbitrary and false. We are all in the same boat because we are all sinners. Let one who has never sinned throw the first stone. We come to realise that to exclude even one sinner would ultimately be to deny our own place in the church community, since we are all sinners. Rather than using our teaching to inform an opportunity for sincere and honest dialogue and reconciliation, go and sin no more, our appeal to Catholic laws and teachings can unfortunately amount to a form of stoning, because it is invariably judged or experienced as accusatory, condemnatory and exclusionary by those being judged. It is not Jesus' way. The effect of Jesus' inclusive and dialogical approach is to draw the woman into conversation while encouraging her onto a new pathway through his exercise of a non-judgmental mercy and by mediating an experience of forgiveness and connection. Note that even after she has been told to go, presumably back to her husband, we don't know that, her relationship with Jesus remains. Would we, in this instance, criticise Jesus for watering down or weakening Catholic teaching on marriage because of his merciful and reconciliatory approach he has taken with someone who has been unfaithful to her husband? Actually, many Catholics today would. Why do I say that? Because there are many in our church right now who are accusing Pope Francis and others of abandoning church teaching because of their insistence on the need to give greater priority to mercy and forgiveness and reconciliation. This is, as already alluded to tonight, being evidenced in the current debates about how we should treat those in irregular marriage relationships, to name just one example. This gospel story is perhaps all the more pertinent for the fact that there are more than a few who, in their writing and commentary around the contentious question of remarriage and reception of the sacraments, actually use the term adultery to describe the situation of those who, for a variety of reasons, are now in committed marriage relationships, having gone through a divorce. Even if technically the term is, from a Catholic sacramental perspective, canonically or theologically or morally accurate. I maintain that it carries strong condemnatory and judgmental overtones which make it less than adequate, less than ethical. I recently experienced a modern-day account of this story when a woman who had previously been involved in prostitution stood up very bravely in front of a large gathering of Christians, and having told her very tragic story, which included childhood violence and sexual abuse, concluded by saying, "Don't judge me, because I have already judged myself." Sometimes, perhaps many times, the gospel story we've heard also reminds that we need to deliberately and courageously ignore those around us who are demanding an answer, who are waving the law books. Ignore those who are demanding that the force of the law and its consequences be applied according to the letter of the law. Note, however, that Jesus does not ignore the accusers themselves, engaging also in clever dialogue with them. How does Jesus respond to the clamour and insistent demands of the Pharisees and religious teachers? He focuses on the woman in front of him and on her story. He doesn't need to remind her that she's done wrong. She knows it well. She doesn't need to be judged by him or others because she will have already judged herself. She wants reconciliation, and in this story that comes about primarily through the relationship and dialogue initiated by Jesus, the woman goes away empowered, forgiven, and encouraged to live differently. Which is why, as a moral theologian and ethicist, I would argue that ethical behaviour always requires that we, as disciples in the first instance, initiate and then maintain sincere dialogue with others, no matter who they are, no matter what their beliefs, no matter what they have done. The truth is in conversation. That in turn requires of us an enduring commitment to forming and maintaining relationships. For those of us who are parents and who may have had a child that has behaved in ways that harm themselves or others, or who may have even caused deep wounds to the parent-child relationship, whose actions may have been at odds with the values of the family, the first call on our love, the ethical imperative demanded by our role as parents, is to maintain that relationship so that dialogue can continue. Faithful, loving dialogue. As Cardinal Christoph Schonborn of Vienna recently noted, to take this approach is not to pretend that everything in all those situations is fine, but to help Catholics build on what is good, growing in holiness and faithfulness to God and each other. For the most part, those of us who are parents know intuitively that this is what's required of us, even when or if at times we don't always live up to that ideal. The reaction of the institutional church should be the same. For this reason, I would maintain that the way of parents, the way of families, provides a sure pathway for the church in this time in its quest to discover anew what it is to speak and act truthfully and ethically. Therefore, while we rightfully think of the church as family, I suggest that we have to think more about the family as showing what it means to be church, and perhaps think first of the family as church so that we can inspire the church to act properly as family. It's all there in paragraph 52 of Gaudium et Spes. I quote, "The family is a kind of school of deeper humanity in which the various generations come together and help one another grow wiser and harmonise personal rights with the other requirements of social living. Given our society's current dalliance with a neoliberal, individualistic, rights-based approach to moral analysis and decision-making, it strikes me that the need for families, for strong families, to operate as schools wherein we learn to harmonise personal rights with concern for the common good is greater than ever. The mercy and love shown by the Church must be of the same genus as the mercy and love practiced daily by those of us who are parents. The love and mercy exercised by the Church must take its inspiration from faith-filled and committed couples and families. As Pope Francis has reiterated in recent days, and I quote, "Christian couples and families are often in better conditions to proclaim Jesus Christ to other families, to support, fortify and encourage them. What you live as a couple and as a family, the profound and irreplaceable joy that the Lord makes you feel in your domestic intimacy between the joys and sorrows, and the happiness of the presence of your spouse, and the growth of your children, and the human and spiritual fruitfulness that He grants you. All this is witnessed, proclaimed, and communicated outside so that others, in turn, will put themselves on this path." Pope Francis's words echo paragraph 47 of Gaudium et Spes, where we read, "The well-being of the individual person and of human and Christian society is intimately linked with the healthy condition of that community produced by marriage and the family." Which means, I think, when it comes to matters of the family, that even while as families we look to the Church for moral guidance, the Church, in its quest for the truth, must strive to set up honest and sincere dialogue with parents and families and commit itself to listening rather than assuming to know what it should be teaching us and how it should be responding to the critical issues affecting families at this time. Let's take very quickly some of the neon issues. I'm just going to name them. Contraception, divorce, cohabitation, homosexuality, remarriage. All of these are going to be debated by the upcoming synod. What family has not been touched by these issues? How, as parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles, brothers and sisters, do we intuitively respond to the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of our family members and loved ones who find themselves living in the gap? While leaning on God and praying for God's grace, we remain committed above all to our relationships with our children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews and siblings, committed through thick and thin. We know that to act ethically is above all to do everything to maintain the relationship, to do everything to be inclusive, to do everything we can to avoid being judgmental, while always still remaining both honest and sincere and prudent in terms of what we say. As already noted, honest, respectful and sincere dialogue is what lies at the heart of all couple relationships as well as at the heart of families. Even when it does not come easily for us, we are instinctively committed to fostering and maintaining the relationship with our whānau in all circumstances. We know instinctively that maintaining the relationship is what is key to healing and growth. We know instinctively that sharing food and eating at the family meal table together is critical to maintaining that relationship, because without that, dialogue won't happen. We know that you don't invite somebody into the home and then eat in front of them without inviting them to join us at the table. Should this not inform the ongoing and current theological and pastoral discussion about the rights of people who are divorced to approach the Eucharistic table? It's a question. To conclude, looking at Gaudium et Spes through a moral and ethical lens points us towards what I would call a relational, responsible approach to seeking the truth, toward a moral framework that sees sin primarily in terms of the rupturing of relationships, and that sees grace manifest above all in relational harmony and reconciliation at all levels, with ourselves, with God, with each other, and with the created order. And that last point has been forcibly emphasised most recently by Pope Francis in his encyclical Laudato Si. As parents and families, we know that the best place for healing and growth and for the restoration of relationships happens by keeping people within or drawing them back into the whānau. This is what Jesus does in the account of the woman caught in adultery. It should also be the model for what the Church must do if it is to act ethically. Ethically speaking, this means as a church we commit ourselves to moving out into the public square, to dialogue with those who are, for want of a better word, out of step with our teaching. We do not need to judge them because, without doubt, they have already judged themselves. They need to know that they are welcomed. Reconciliation and forgiveness happen in and through dialogue and conversation, including and especially the sort of conversation that happens around the meal table. And yet too many Catholics seem to argue that reconciliation and forgiveness should be precursors to coming back to the Eucharistic table. That is not the way of families. At the same time, we need to remember that through our encounter with these people, we will ourselves be challenged and find ourselves called to a greater authenticity, to a greater and purer love, to greater acceptance and greater caring. By extension, and at the institutional church level, this approach also commits us to listen and dialogue with those within our own tradition who may think differently with us about what I've referred to as, about what are the neon issues, the neon moral issues. We must accept that there are different approaches to minding that gap between the fullness of life we are called to and the lived reality that the woman in John's Gospel and many of us, as well as our families and friends, find ourselves in. Allow me to finish by drawing from the concluding paragraph of Gaudium et Spes. Mindful of the Lord's saying, "By this will all know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." Christians cannot yearn for anything more ardently than to serve the people of the modern world with mounting generosity and success. Therefore, by holding faithfully to the gospel and benefiting from its resources, by joining with everyone who loves and practices justice, Christians have shouldered a gigantic task for fulfilment in this world, a task concerning which they must give a reckoning to God, who will judge each of us on the last days. Thank you very much.